Hi everybody, this is John from DM Shower Thoughts, and today one of the things I'm going to be discussing is the difference between, say, a rules lawyer and a rules enthusiast. And enthusiast may not be the best word for it, but it's the word I came up with, so let's discover that a little bit. So in my search for discussing certain things like rules lawyering, I like to always have the definition of the term that we're talking about, so that when I discuss it, I do it intelligently. So, of course, the first thing I went towards is the most reliable source on the internet, Wikipedia. So, according to Wikipedia, a rules lawyer is a participant in a rules-based environment who attempts to use the letter of the law without reference to the spirit, usually in order to gain an advantage within that environment. In terms of 5th edition, rules lawyering means that you're using the mechanics of the game to argue how a certain situation or a check might be resolved, as opposed to trusting the DM to make a rules adjudication that's going to be appropriate for the story or whatever atmosphere they're trying to go for. A lot of times, rules lawyers in Dungeons & Dragons are often mocked or looked down on in the Dungeons & Dragons community because they end up doing something called metagaming, which is viewing the game as a system of rules rather than being immersed in the storytelling that the community is there to kind of create, right? So wherever your table is, oftentimes the rules lawyer is someone who may interrupt the DM, or they may question a rules call that the DM has adjudicated. In its worst form, a lot of times another player is trying to be creative, and the rules lawyer attempts to shut down that player's action by referencing something in the rules that doesn't allow them to do it. Now, the reason that I want to differentiate between a rules lawyer and a rules enthusiast is because usually when people think of a rules lawyer, they're thinking of the opposite of fun, right? They're usually thinking of an individual that's using the rules as either a way to get what they want, or they feel like that's how the game is supposed to be played. Now, one of the things I love about 5th edition is right away, in the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide, they very clearly establish the Dungeon Master as the final authority in terms of rules adjudication. And while 5th edition has rules as written, while it does have kind of like official language that it uses to establish its rule set, there's nothing that the Dungeon Master can't change in it. And ultimately, the Dungeon Master is the one who's running the game. They're the ones that understand how their custom world works or how magic works in their world. And so they're free to change anything. Of course, this can add some contention with players that are expecting one version of the game versus how the DM chooses to adjudicate. And oftentimes, that's part of the fun of Dungeons & Dragons, is finding the similarities between those two styles of play. Finding a way where everyone can achieve mutual understanding in a way that they can relax and have fun, because really that's what Dungeons & Dragons is all about. As a simple aside, when it comes to rules lawyering, one of the things I like to remember is Dungeons & Dragons is, in essence, a homebrew world game by design. Gary Gygax, when he did it, it was a custom rule set to chainmail, and he was just a wargamer that wanted to try something new. So anytime anybody is like super rules lawyer, I like to remember that the original Dungeon Master, Gary Gygax, a lot of times doesn't even play by the rules as written. He was just trying to come up with rules that would make sense to run a style of game or a certain feeling that he had. So what I like to think of myself as is more of a rules enthusiast than a rules lawyer. I do like discussing rules and mechanics, and when it comes to a DM adjudicating, I don't necessarily want to get my way. I want to clarify their reasoning behind the rules that they adjudicate or the decision that they make. A lot of times this can happen where, say, like a player misuses an ability, where the DM will like give themselves advantage on something. As the player, I'm coming from a place of curiosity as opposed to accusation. A lot of times, because I'm a DM, and I'm known as a DM in a lot of the circles that I play with, a lot of times when I go to question something that's more mechanical in nature, there is a trust that I do kind of know what I'm talking about, as opposed to just being another player that's trying to get their way. If you play with me and you disagree, feel free to comment below and call me out. So a lot of times when like a rules thing comes up, the first thing I like to do is instead of give statements, I ask questions, right? So I might say, why did you rule it like that? Or are you sure that's what the ability does? Or are you sure that's how you want them to use the ability? And the reason I ask it like that is usually what I'm saying is, like, the rule book says this. Based on what Jeremy Crawford and Sage Advice has said, I usually like to bring up some sort of evidence when I like do this kind of stuff. This is what they said their intention was with the rule. If you make a different call, like if there's a circumstantial factor involved, or maybe we're going to rule it just this once because there's something, it's like a special moment, like I'm cool with it. A lot of times when I'm doing this as a rules enthusiast, the outcome itself doesn't matter as much as the DM's process. Now, a lot of the times the DM will be like, oh, I forgot that rule, or I misunderstood it, or wow, I really always thought this rule was intended for this, but now I see the balance points of it. And a lot of times they may make an adjustment to their adjudication, which lines up with the rules as written. Other times a DM will say things like, no, there might be a factor you don't know, or they'll explain their reasoning, which to me helps me grow as a DM because now I'm more educated on somebody else's point of view. How the DM chooses to adjudicate doesn't matter to me as much as their thought process and their logic. Because if I understand how they're thinking of it as a DM, now that helps me get stronger as a DM too. Now, the one thing I will say that kind of chafes me is when people say like, oh, that's rules as written instead of rules as intended. Unless you're a game designer for 5th edition, or you have like evidence of what a game designer from 5th edition has said, you as a player can really speak to what you think the spirit is, but you can't say for certain what the rules as intended are. I just remember there was one time I got into an argument with an individual where it was over whether or not a monk's unarmed strike should be considered a finessed weapon, specifically to see if it would interact with the rogue's sneak attack feature. Now I said that, my point was if you read the martial arts feature, that nowhere does it say it's considered a finesse weapon, only that you can use dexterity for the attack and damage rolls. And I believe that was intentional as a balance point so it wouldn't as easily interact with sneak attack. You would need something like a dagger or a short sword, a specific weapon that did have the finesse property in order to interact. Now, I could be wrong, and this individual said, well, if it were my game, I would rule it like that. And I said, I respect your opinion, and the rules as written are a little different. And one of the things he said is, well, I'm not sure that was the rules as intended. The rules as intended is something that we can't speak to unless we created the mechanics, which I've played with a lot of DMs where they do have custom mechanics, or they play with variant rules, and they explain their intention behind it, and that really helps give the game a certain type of atmosphere, right? But one of the reasons I tend to use a lot of rules as written in my game is so I can set up my players to be successful no matter which table they're at. If we have a really clear understanding of the rules as written, it allows us to understand different dungeon masters' rules as intended, where they may make a change or a separate adjudication not based on the rules as written because there's either some kind of background logic going on, or they either explain that a certain rule may not work with the narrative that they're trying to tell. A really quick example of this is one of the rules I use is something called gang up flanking. So, you know, if you look at the variant rule of flanking in the Dungeon Master's Guide, really it means that there needs to be 2 hostile creatures on either side of an enemy that's in the middle, and then the enemy in the middle gets attacks with advantage on them by just those 2 creatures. Now, I always thought it didn't really make sense that if you stick now a 3rd creature kind of like, say, above them while these 2 creatures are flanking, it doesn't get advantage. Like, its kicks don't hit as hard, you know? So one of the things I do is basically if you can achieve initial flanking, any additional melee attackers within that flanking circle also get advantage. A lot of DMs may say it's broken. I've never found that to be the case because, again, now when you have swarms of enemies, it makes them even more dangerous. So a lot of times, like, for example, I adjusted a variant rule with my own little variation, and I have an explanation for it. You can argue with it. You can say that it's unbalanced, however you'd like, and your opinion is valid. I found something that works for my table. So I'm curious for you guys. What are your opinions on rules lawyers? And are you someone who could be a rules enthusiast? Again, I find that the only distinction is a rules lawyer will make statements and say that the DM should act in a certain way or adjudicate a certain way, where a rules enthusiast is just more curious why a DM adjudicates the way that they do. Alright? So, that's it for today, everybody. I hope you guys have an awesome day, and remember, game responsibly. Bye-bye now.